IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Arjun and I work as a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. I work in the high-tech geopolitics program, which basically is at the intersection of technology and geopolitics. To discuss more about this itself, we have with us a special guest today. His name is Anirudh Suri and he is the author of The Great Tech Game. So Anirudh's book came out this year and the book looks at exactly what we do in the high-tech geopolitics program, especially on the technology and the geopolitics front. So Anirudh is actually a managing partner at India Internet Fund, which is a venture capital fund based in India, and also has worked with the government of India in Delhi, in McKinsey, and at Carnegie Endowment in Washington. So he has actually extensively written on foreign policy, geopolitics, technology, entrepreneurship, and has appeared in various publications such as Indian Express, Hindustan Times, Foreign Policy, and Asia Times. He completed his MBA from the Wharton School at UPenn and his MPA from Harvard Kennedy. And he also served as a director on the board of the Harvard Alumni Association and was also named Goldman Sachs Global Leader. Welcome, Anirudh. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
No, thank you so much, Arjun. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you. So let's get into it. One question I have for you is the first question actually I have for you is, as a venture capitalist, right? What was your intention behind writing this book? You were not, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're not from a technical background and you were involved in the governance field, but not in the technology side of it, right? But what was this a book like? Why was this book your main goal? And was it just due to the paucity of literature in the field, or was it because you thought it was the right time to make the general audience aware of the subject and kind of bring this into the limelight?
So, Arjun, as you've gathered from the things that I've done in my sort of professional experience over the last decade and a half, I spent time, I would say, across both ends of the spectrum, the tech and the policy ends of the spectrum, right? Having worked in think tanks in Washington, worked in the Indian government for a little while, and having worked on the business and technology side over the last decade as a venture capitalist and a tech entrepreneur, in my head, a lot of the dots were getting connected, but I found that the dots were not necessarily getting connected for everyone so obviously, right? So one of the goals, as you rightly mentioned, was the paucity of literature in the field. I thought that there were lots of disparate articles talking about how tech and geopolitics were intersecting. And also lots of articles talking about, let's say, the US-China battle over technology and trade. But I thought that what was missing really out there and what was brewing in my head was this big picture around how tech was shaping our world order, our economies, our societies. And of course, my own interest lay at the intersection of tech and geopolitics, much like, I guess, for you and the rest of your colleagues at Takshashila, especially in the program you specifically work at. So for me, really, the goal was to bring together a lot of those dots, a lot of those pieces, and put out that big picture for folks to understand what was really going on in our world, right? And I think that it's very important to understand that bigger picture and that broad perspective, and that helps you place a lot of the developments that are happening day in, day out, right? Whether it's competition or conflict between states, whether it's conflict between big tech firms and governments, whether it's conflict between different parts of society that believe that they are being excluded from this new game, what I call the great tech game. So I thought that that big picture is really very important for everyone to grasp, no matter whether they are from a field, from the technology field or not, right? So as you rightly mentioned, I'm not necessarily from a technical engineering background myself, but having been in the sort of tech industry now for the last decade, I thought it's important for everyone to understand the big picture, not just folks in the tech VC world or in the tech policy world, but really for everyone to understand, because I think that's impacting all of our lives, no matter what fields we are in.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, as an engineer myself, okay, a former engineer myself, and now working in the policy space, especially the technology policy space, I also have to concur with you because there were a lot of articles, there were a bunch of people who were trying to relate these two fields together, but couldn't come up with a actual framework to do it. And we did not have a, like a go-to book or a 101 paper or something like that, wherein you could actually understand what is the relationship between technology and geopolitics and how technology can shape the world order. I think your book itself is a great introduction to it. And as you said, right, it's not just catered towards the people with a technical background or who have worked in technology itself. And that makes it much better for anyone who wants to kind of get into the field or at least understand what exactly we're talking about without actually going into the specific technical details. So that's a great thing. Yeah. So one thing, in your book, right, you start off with the growth and development of agriculture and trade and how that cannot got translated and into kind of conflicts and tension. In what ways do you think that modern day technology has followed the same path of growth? And has it ever, like, for you, has it deviated from the traditional growth models which was followed by agriculture or trade or even industrialization?
Yeah, so what I've tried to do in the first section of the book, right, as you've seen in what I call the historical context section, I've tried to provide people a historical context to understand what is happening today. And one of the ways I've tried to do that is to provide the framework of the great games of the past. Right? So I've argued that there have been some major great games in our history as humankind, and I've highlighted a few. I've highlighted the great agri game, the great trading game, the great colonization and industrialization game, and more recently the great capitalism game. And I've tried to explain to folks that, in each of these eras or each of these great games that we've lived through in the past, these great games tend to do two or three things that are worth noting. One, whenever these new trends or new shapers have emerged, whether it was agriculture or whether it was global trade, it leads to a new set of winners and losers, right? Countries or regions or people that get this game the best, that understand the contours of the game, that then develop capabilities to play that game well, end up being winners in that era, right? And I've pointed out who some of the winners were in the great agri game, India being one of them, or the ancient river based civilizations of the past, being the winners then, and so on and so forth. The industrial era clearly had different winners, the trading era had different winners, the great capitalism game, of course, had different winners as well. The other piece to note about these great games in the past, Arjun, that I've tried to highlight is that different factors of production or different capabilities become important. And to your question about whether technology or the great tech game, in the great tech game, are we following the same growth models as, let's say, the great agri game or the great trading game or the great capitalism game? I argue that there are similarities, but there are also differences. Right? The similarities are that each of these great games, in a way, have built on the great games of the past. Right? So I can't win at the great industrialization game or the great colonization game without also winning at the great trading game. Right? So if I am a Western European nation, I master trade and I master agriculture in my colonies as a prerequisite almost to win in the great industrialization game. Right? So Britain, unlike what most people don't understand is that Britain and other Western European colonial powers actually became great agricultural powers, right? They were running massive agricultural estates in the US and India and of course in the Caribbean, right? Where they were producing sugarcane, cotton, and so many other raw materials that then powered their industrial game. Right. So each of these games in a way builds upon the previous ones, and the most recent game that we've had in the world, in my view at least, is the great capitalism game, right? And now in the great tech game, as I argue, the key capability that countries need to build is to master the games of the past and then build the capabilities for this one. Right? So what I mean by that is, if you were a student of economics, you would have been taught that the key factors of production for economic growth are land, labor, and capital. Right? Those three. And that, in a way, if you think about it, has now gotten supplemented by what I call technology as a factor of production. Right? So technology is something now much like capital that countries need to accumulate for boosting their growth. Right? Technology, data, these are the new factors of production that no matter what business you run, no matter what you do in any part of the economy, you need to accumulate, much like in the past you had to accumulate capital to drive your business growth, or in the past, how you had to accumulate labor or land, right? So I think what has changed today is that, unlike in the great capitalism game where capital was the key factor that you were accumulating on top of land and labor, today you have to accumulate technology and data as a way to make each of your other factors of production also more productive. So, having been in the world of venture capital, I can tell you, Arjun, that today capital is chasing technology, not the other way around, because technology is what's driving productivity growth, right? And so today, if anyone was looking at the traditional growth models, you'd have to see, okay, how much is a business or a country or an economy focusing on technological accumulation, technological development. And that really can explain the difference between a faster growing nation versus a slower growing nation.
That's really well put and very interesting to hear, because you come from, again, you're talking from a venture capitalist background and also from an economic background. And as you mentioned, right, the concept of these great games which happened in the past had winners and losers, or at least had clear cut winners, maybe not losers in some cases, but okay, fine. But what exactly are the reasons for these, the divide to happen? Is it just the accessibility to materials, like raw materials in terms of agri or trade? Or is it in just the accessibility to capital in terms of the capitalist game? So when you come to the tech game, right? So how can one ensure, you're on the other side, like, or at least on the side wherein you could utilize whatever comparative advantages you have. So, how should one ensure that you're not in the losing camp, but at least try to be in the winning camp?
Yeah, so I think to try and to be on the winning camp now in the great tech game, you need to look at what are the key capabilities, key assets, or key things that you need to both accumulate and the key capabilities you need to develop, right? I'll list out a few just to give you some examples. So, today in India, for example, if you were to evaluate whether India is an emerging winner in the great tech game, I would say that we are more likely to win than lose in this great tech game, even though we've lost in the great industrialization game, great colonization game, many of the great games of the past. Today, we are in a fairly good position. If you measure, basically, I have this framework that I use in my head, which is five things that you need to win in the great tech game, right? One is, let me lay them out and I'll delve into each of them quickly after that. There's talent, there's capital, there's technology, there's policy, and then there's a strategy, right? So there are these five things that I believe countries, no matter what country you are today in the world, whether you're in India, whether you're Singapore, whether you're Israel, you're an African nation, you're a Latin American nation, doesn't matter. I think this framework would apply to you. You need to get these five things right today: tech, talent, capital, strategy, and policy. When I talk about talent, for example, you need to be, as a country, building talent that is tech savvy, that is educated in tech, educated in the use of tech, educated in the building of tech, right? And on that front, for example, India is decently placed, right? As you and all of us know, right? I mean, we have fairly good engineering talent pool in India. Of course, we have great managerial talent as well. Often we lose some of that, obviously, to Silicon Valley and other parts of the world, but we do have a good base going, right? There's capital. Having been in the VC world, I can tell you the last decade or so, a lot of capital has now become available for entrepreneurs, even traditional businesses, but even new tech entrepreneurs to build their businesses out, right? So you have the capital also available by and large. On the tech now, right? When I say you have to accumulate tech, I mean actually ownership and control of technology, IP, right? Ownership of IP. You need to own some of the technology that lets you build moats around your businesses and not just be a user of technology or a consumer of technology. Right? You've got to be a producer and owner as well. And I think that's a key difference, a point of difference that we need to note. We're a big consumer nation, right? We're a big consumer economy. We're a large digital economy today. We have the second or third largest number of users when it comes to smartphones and the internet, etc. Right? Any of those metrics on the consumer side, I think we'll end up being in the top two or three. But the question is, are we producing enough of our own tech? Are we owning a lot of the tech IP that's getting built in the world? I would argue that not. Right. And I think this is some of the work you've also done at Takshashila and your colleagues, that we are not actually doing as much R&D in India as we should be doing, both in the driven by the private sector and the public sector. We are not building some of the core operating system type layers of the software stack that we should be building. Right. We are very strong on services and integrating this tech stack for other businesses. Right. I mean, that's what our IT services majors do. They help digital transformation of other companies, but they're basically taking software or products built by other companies, often US or European companies, and helping them get adopted or integrated into the IT systems of large global companies. But we're not building as much of that core tech IP that we should be. And third, the tech infrastructure also that underlays today the global tech ecosystem. We don't have ownership of a lot of that, right? So whether you look at the undersea cables that today over 95% of the internet traffic moves over. None of the Indian companies today own any of those undersea cables, and that exposes us to certain geopolitical risks. I've talked in the book about how, in the past, the British controlled the telegraph infrastructure. This is about 100, 150 years ago. And they leveraged that when World War I and World War II broke out. Right? One of the first things the Brits did was they cut off the cables connecting Germany to other parts of the world, and the repair capabilities, the ships, the raw materials needed for repairing the telegraph cables all lay majorly with the Brits, and that gave them a big geopolitical advantage. And similarly today, like in case of conflict, geopolitical conflict, which is now obviously very, very likely now in the coming years, countries need to be aware of who owns the tech infrastructure, who owns the financial tech infrastructure, and what are you doing to secure it, right? So that's the tech piece when I talk about it. The strategy and policy piece are the other two pieces of the framework, right? So when it comes to policy, we can, you also are interested in tech policy, as am I. We can spend hours talking about different aspects of tech policy that needs to be focused on in India or any other part of the world. But suffice it to say that on the policy front, we must understand that the game has changed. We are no longer in the great industrialization game, and hence industrial era policies should not be driving our tech policy, right? The concerns that policymakers had during the industrial era are not the same that you'll have in the great tech game. You have to understand that as a basic fact. You have to reorient yourself to say, okay, now we're in a different game. We need to adapt our policies to make sure that we are not, remaining stuck in frameworks that have been built for an industrial era economy, right? And I think that's the main problem that we today are facing in most countries, that policymakers are largely have been trained in industrial era policies, labor policies, land policies, trade policies that are all, I would say, pertaining to a previous economic game, previous geopolitical game. The game has changed, and hence we need to adapt. Our policymakers need to adapt their frameworks and their thinking accordingly. And then finally, like the strategy piece, I think, which, partly my own background as a strategy consultant maybe is at play here, but I think a country, no matter big or small, needs to have a clear strategy on how to win in this great tech game, Arjun. So it's not so easy as just saying that let's get internet users and hence we'll win this game. As I've been, saying in the last few minutes, India must figure out, as should other countries, what its economic strategy is to make sure that we are a key player in the great tech game and the global tech ecosystem. So I'll again draw an analogy to the industrial era. Back in the industrial era, if you look in the last 50, 70 years, Southeast Asian nations figured out their niche in that industrial supply chain, global industrial supply chain. They figured out, okay, we'll be the ones who'll be manufacturing XYZ key components, and we'll become assemblers, and exporters of these products on a cheaper basis than what the Europeans and Americans can. And that was their niche, right? Similarly, today, countries who are not the leaders in the great tech game, like the US is or China is to some extent, must figure out what our role has to be in this global tech ecosystem. Are we going to be just a services player as we've been for the last 20, 30 years? Or are we going to now take that next step and start building some of that core tech IP, start building some of that core tech infrastructure, start building the operating system, start innovating whenever new technology comes out as opposed to banning it or lagging behind on it for 10 years and then saying, okay, now let's try and catch up, right? You do a lot of work on semiconductors at Takshashila as well. Semiconductors was a game that started many decades ago, right? And India was one of the first few players to actually recognize that semiconductors back in the 80s that it's something that we should build out. Now, we lost for various reasons 30 years and are now lagging behind the Taiwans and Koreas of the world. But I argue in the book that we must, as a strategy, have our eye on the next wave of technologies and make sure that we are early leaders in those as opposed to being laggards, right? And so that kind of strategy, which is forward looking, I think is also very important. So I would say those are the 5 key pieces of the framework that I think nations need to keep in mind to win, or at least be on the relative scale, be on the winning side.
That's a very comprehensive answer. And I think what you mentioned regarding the tech IP, right? That's something that I totally agree with. And that's we've been working on that. Especially I've been working on technology standards and how this kind of gives you the economic leverage or even the geopolitical leverage in some cases. And we do not have to kind of depend on licensing and other stuff wherein we do not have to depend on the Western countries or the ones who have already established themselves. So what you said is totally correct regarding the tech IP front. And that kind of goes into my next question, right? So in this point in the 21st century, right, we kind of know how much technology plays a role in each state's economy, regardless of whether it's already an established tech power or it's a developing tech power. And you've delved quite a bit into it in your book also, wherein you've created a separate section on how technology affects geoeconomics. But in your opinion, do you think this increased contribution of technologies to the economies of different nations is a positive step towards development, or does it also have many dependencies and kind of gives offensive options to others like your rivals to use technology to target you, such as sanctions, like how we saw in the Russia-Ukraine war, wherein there were specific technology sanctions which were imposed on Russia and preventing high-tech imports to Russia and kind of crippling the technology sector in the country itself, which would have had a massive impact on the country's economy. So is this increased economic implication of technology both a boon and a bane?
No, for sure, for sure. I think that it's a two-sided coin for sure. I think where it's a boon is that it provides countries that are, let's say, developing nations an opportunity to leapfrog and become winners in this new great tech game if they're to get the game, right? If they don't get this game and they keep playing, as I was just saying, if they keep playing a game that is now of the past, then they're likely to lose in this game as well, right? For example, back in our own history as India, we are playing the great land-based trading game in the Mughal times, but we forget that the game is now changing and becoming a global naval trading game, and we don't compete and win in that, then we lose the game, right? The game that's actually emerging as the main current game. Similarly, today, I think that if we or any developing nation doesn't get the contours of the new game, which is what I've tried to provide in this book, I think then they are likely to lose in this game. That's one. Second, on the flip side of it, countries that do get it have the ability to now leapfrog and become winners, right? So I think that India, for example, Taiwan, Korea, Israel, Singapore, Estonia, many other countries will come to mind that are not, but even China, to be honest, is probably the biggest example. These countries that were not necessarily winners in the previous game now have an opportunity to become winners in this current game. Because the game has changed, every new game gives an opportunity for new winners, right, to emerge. Now, that's on one side from an economic standpoint. So it's a massive opportunity as I see it. But of course, if you miss it, there's massive implications, much like if you didn't industrialize early and play that game, then for the next 200, 300 years, you are now, a developing nation, you're now basically always trying to catch up. Now, that's the geoeconomic side. On the geopolitical side, which is what you are also asking about, is technology gonna get weaponized? Is it a tool that will be used by the owners of technology or by those who control the technology or the tech advanced states against their rivals or their opponents? For sure, right? As I was saying, the telegraph by the Brits against the Germans, right? 100, 150 years ago. So there's no doubt in my mind that if you look at history, Arjun, that the nature of geopolitical competition doesn't change. How countries act to deny their opponents the key things that those opponents need to develop or to do well, that part of our human behavior or country's behavior, that has not changed. Only the tools have changed. The tools that they will use now, as you're rightly saying, are going to be a lot more tech driven, right? So if earlier trade based tariffs or trade based blockages would be put to deny certain countries certain things, today there'll be a lot more tech driven sanctions because that's what really matters for economies now, right? So, and that's what you're seeing in the case of the West versus Russia, right? A lot of people think that the Russia Ukraine war is an example of how we are still living in a World War II type state of war be conducted. I actually believe that's exactly not right. Today, if you look at, as you were alluding to, if you look at how the West has responded to Russia's actions, it's by denying them technology, by denying them access to the SWIFT network for their banks, by denying them access to hardware, by denying them access to software, etc. And so I do think that you're right that tech driven blockages, tech driven denials, tech driven sanctions, these are increasingly going to become tools that technologically advanced nations will use in geopolitical conflict. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you so much, Anirudh. Yeah, so before we continue with the conversation, let's just take a small break and we'll be right back.
Hello, everybody. It's been another awesome, great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks to author, speaker, business leader, and investor S. Venkatesh. They discuss the power of creativity and their philosophies about it. On The Wire Talks, Siddharth talks to Wendy Doniger about her book An American Girl in India, Letters and Recollections from 1963 to 64. On Cyrus Says It's Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Shreyas, Harsh, and Antariksh discuss the claims of Delhi air pollution, reducing your life by 10 years. On Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurabh debate whether government policies have made the media dependent on advertising. And on The Longest Constitution, Priya analyzes the employer's responsibility in the Bhopal gas tragedy case. We got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has just launched its merch line, and you should check it out now. Head over to the IVM Podcast website, that's ivmpodcast.com, and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Also, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. That really does help. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And also do remember, you can check out a number of our shows on YouTube. You can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to get a list of the channels that we are keeping active. We also are doing a small listener survey. If you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey to fill this out, it'll just take a few minutes and it really helps us out. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Apne Liye, Apno Ke Liye. Jupiter, a digital banking app. Capgemini, get the future you want. Intel vPro, built for business. And Intel, future banao wonderful with Intel-powered laptops.
Welcome back to this episode of All Things Policy. We are in a conversation with Anirudh Suri, who is the author of The Great Tech Game. Before the break, we were just talking about how there is a geoeconomic implication of technology and how it can be used both for development and as an offensive tool. Now, getting into the geopolitical angle, right? So we understand that technology is impacting geopolitics in ways that could not have been imagined, let's say, 20 years back. And at the heart of that comes the US-China tech war. So there is a constant, talk about how China is trying to surpass US as the next big economy, next big tech power. And we always talk about, when we talk about the fact that there has been some emerging or critical technology, we talk about how China has been developing that, trying to surpass the US in terms of whatever they're doing. Let's say it's in quantum, it's in AI, it's in renewables. So, what my question, Anirudh, is just that should we restrict ourselves in this talk about the geopolitics of technology to just the US and China? Or are there emerging players like, let's say, India, Japan, Singapore, who can kind of have a seat at the table, right? So now we see that it's increasingly a multipolar world in terms of the strategic side, but from the technology aspect also, has it just become a bipolar contest, or is there a multipolar thing to it also?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, Arjun. One of the reasons I've written this book and I've called this the Great Tech Game and I've talked about it in a global context is exactly for the reason that I absolutely agree with you. I think that this should not be seen as just a US China game. This is a global game. This is a multiplayer game. It's a multipolar world we are living in. And if you look at most of the literature out there, it tends to make it seem like it's just a US China battle, as you rightly are questioning. I think that we in India, folks in Europe, folks in Southeast Asia, folks in other parts of Asia and Africa, Latin America, everywhere, need to actually very strongly question this framing of technological competition and battles as that this should not actually be seen as just a US China affair. In my mind, that is probably one of the biggest problems in the current literature, that it's being framed like that, right? I think that actually this is a game or a phenomenon that every country, no matter big or small, fast growing or not, needs to have a view and a strategy on. Because this will end up shaping our geopolitics, our world order, our economies, our societies, everywhere, in every country. Every country needs to have a plan in place, a strategy in place, and all sort of those five pieces of that framework that I mentioned earlier. Now, is it inevitable that the US and China will dictate how this phenomenon unfolds? I think it is possible, no doubt, because they are two very strong tech nations and obviously at opposing ends of the values and philosophical spectrums. And of course, one is challenging the supremacy of the other. So it's obviously likely that they'll end up shaping, or the battle between them will end up becoming a Cold War esque type situation where countries are asked to choose one person, one country's side or the others. But I think it's imperative that other nations, whether Europe or any other, or India or other parts of Asia, Latin America and Africa, resist that kind of temptation to choose a side. And I think if you look at how India has also been positioning itself in recent months, right, with the recent geopolitical conflicts, it's clear that India also does not necessarily want to be placed in a position where it's choosing one or the other, right? Ultimately, what matters is that for countries is how they will end up competing in this game, how they will end up winning in this game, because the economic and political destinies of their people is at stake, right? So I do think that there's a very important piece that countries need to resist this kind of temptation of letting this be framed as a US China affair only. That's one. Second, now you asked whether growing powers, emerging powers have even a way to get a seat at the table, right? And I think that's a very important question. That's the action oriented question. And I do think that, yes, a lot of countries have a role to play. A lot of countries, if they play their cards right, will get a seat at the table, but they've got to play their cards right? So let me give you a few examples to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So, back in the day when the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions were being formed in the post World War II era, right? We in India famously talk about how we gave up our UN Security Council seat to China, right? And now, 70 years later, 80 years later, we are still trying to battle it out for that seat at the table, right? For the UN Security Council seat. Now, in my mind today, there are several tech governance institutions, right? ITU, ICANN, many others, that are now increasingly becoming very important or becoming center stage at who will set the standards, who will set the policies, who will set the rules of the great tech game. So to me, it's very important that countries like India, for example, keep a focus not just on that UN Security Council seat that we've been, looking to get for the last several decades, but also make sure that we get a seat at the governance tables of these new emerging, more like growing in importance type of institutions that are deciding the rules of the great tech game. If you look at these tech governance institutions that I'm referring to, and you look at Indian participation in or Indian leadership in these governance institutions, you'll be amazed that we are almost non-present. And not because the countries that are currently present there don't want us. Largely, these governance institutions today are being dominated by three sets of players: Europeans, followed now by the Chinese, and America. Right? And there's no reason that India actually, if it puts its mind and heart and focus on it, wouldn't get a seat at this table. We would, but we've got to make that a priority. Right? We've got to focus on that. Goes back to the point I was saying about having an eye on the next game and not just on the previous game. I'm not saying give up the aim for the UN Security Council seat, but do have your eye on the next set of governance institutions where you want a seat at the table. Make sure you get it now as opposed to then having to fight for it, a couple of decades down the line. Right. The other piece is that, what's very interesting, I think, Arjun, is when I started writing the book, I had a fairly pessimistic view myself of whether laggards would actually be able to catch up. Tech laggards would be able to catch up to the US and China. I really was very pessimistic, and I thought that it was a done deal. It was, a game that had sort of almost become close to new emerging entrants. But as I studied this whole phenomenon, I realized that actually within the broader great tech game context framework that I've provided, there are waves of new technologies that emerge. That every time in each of those waves, new winners can emerge, right? So similarly in the industrial era, by the way, the countries that were ahead because of the steam engine were not the ones that were ahead because of the invention of electricity. The US actually was not the early inventor of some of the industrial technologies. Neither was Germany, but US and Germany are very good examples from the industrial era of how they caught up to the early industrialization nations like, let's say, the UK, right? And of course, then overtook the UK in the case of the US at least, right? So similarly, today in the great tech game, there are new emerging waves of technology always. And so countries need to have their eye on those new emerging waves and see, even if we've lost, for example, the wave that the B2C internet wave that created Google and Facebook and Amazon, there's no reason for us to say that we will lose in the next wave, which could, let's say, be climate technology, right? Now, if we keep trying to think that we need to win and compete with Google and Facebook and build our own versions of Google and Facebook, then we might actually miss the next wave, which is, let's say, climate tech, right? And I again go back to the point I've rehashed a few times today in our conversation is keep an eye on that next game if you want to see it at the table. Tomorrow, even if you haven't built Googles and Facebooks and Amazons of the world out of India, you could build out some of the best climate tech companies out of India, because that's a game that's still early in its development. And that to me is a key entry path for you to be at that at the table, right? At the deciding seat on the table if you have competence and leadership in that new way, in a way. Right? So there are many ways in which I would say that other countries other than the US or China can actually be part of the table, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. I think there are more and more fields of technology which are emerging in very less periods of time. Like I'm pretty sure no one would have expected semiconductors to become such a geopolitical focal point, and even quantum tech to kind of reach the application stage it has reached in the last 2 decades. And as you said, right, with climate tech, and there is so much happening in the technology realm that again, India shouldn't restrict itself to, or India or even other countries shouldn't restrict itself to certain sectors itself, which are already established powers and established players, and should always go and move forward and not miss the next trade. So that's a really nice way to put it. And going off on when you mentioned Google and Facebook and the big tech, right? So one of the interesting aspects of your book also talks about the increasing divide between big tech and nation states itself. So we understand that governments hold sway over complete sway over regulatory mechanisms, especially in terms of technology also. But are governments and states well equipped to handle big tech corporations and regulating big tech corporations? Are these regulations are these regulations needed to clip the wings of technology giants who are making their own rules, or will this result in over-regulation and kind of hamper technology innovation in the long run? So we do understand that there has been increasingly, a divide between the big tech corporations in US and the US Congress itself, with multiple of the CEOs deposing in front of Congress and all this happening. So how can we view this? Like, is there regulation needed? What like has the regulation been optimal, or has it been over-regulated, and will that kind of affect technology growth itself?
Yeah. So I think that, the reason I call that particular chapter in my book the tug of war between big tech and the states is that I believe that ultimately you can't end up, as I think you're also alluding to in your question, you can't end up in either of the extremes of that spectrum of overregulation or no regulation. Ultimately, there's no doubt in my mind that certain regulation will be needed, is needed, and will continue to be needed over time to make sure that big tech firms also don't end up overstepping certain societal norms, certain societal values, and certain realms that are clearly the sovereign functions of any government. Right. So clearly regulation is needed. I think big tech firms realize that the world over now, the last several years now, we've seen that battle play out. I think a balance ultimately needs to be found because over-regulation, as you I think are again alluding to, leads to you shutting off what is clearly a strong economic engine for your economy, right? And growth, right? So ultimately a balance has to be found, which is what typically is required of most regulation, right? Most regulation, the trick always is to find the right balance so that you are setting a level playing field for competition to happen and for no one or two players to become overpowerful and become monopolistic or draconian in any way. I think that's obviously, I think, the goal for tech regulation. That's one. The second point I'll make here is that a distinction has to be made between how smaller countries will deal with this issue of regulation of big tech firms and how larger countries will. Right? So larger countries like the US, like even India, are in a much better position to regulate big tech firms because of the inherent strength of being a large consumer market or a large powerful government. Right? So I actually worry less about how governments will fare in the larger nations. I believe that in some of the larger nations like the US, like China, like India, like even the UK, I would say, or Europe, I think governments are strong enough to make sure that the big tech firms are ultimately not stepping on any of the key sovereign functions of governments. Right? I worry much more, however, about smaller nations. I think smaller nations that don't represent such a large market for these big tech firms are much easier influenced and dictated to, right, by big tech firms. And hence, I worry much more about them. Right? And that's where I think global tech governance, global tech norms, global tech governance institutions need to become much stronger so that big tech firms don't just run amok in smaller nations, right, that are not as capable of, let's say, standing up to the big tech firm. India can very easily today tell the big tech firms that, listen, you either obey the rules of the land, the laws of India, or you can leave. But that's not necessarily something that, let's say, a small nation in even other nation in South Asia or Africa could say, right, to Facebook or Google. So I would say that that's another distinction we need to keep in mind about how this battle will play out. The third point I'll make about this battle between, or this tug of war between big tech firms and nation states, Arjun, is that this is going to be a multi-stage game, right? This will likely continue now over the next few decades because big tech firms, the names might change, right? The actual big tech firms might be different in 10 years from now, but big tech firms as a phenomenon will continue to challenge the authority and the domain of nation states I think, going forward. Right? The whole Web3 crypto movement is a clear example that it's not just the Googles and Facebooks of the world that are going to be seen as a threat by nation states, but rather, even tomorrow, large crypto players, large crypto marketplaces, crypto exchanges, all of these guys, when they become big and when their legitimacy is challenged by nation states, these big tech firms will not sit idle because so much is at stake economically for them that they'll find ways to influence governments, they'll find ways to influence societies in other ways because they are so economically powerful and rich and influential, right? So we have to see this as a multi-stage game where some battles or some stages might be won by one or the other, right? I believe that the battle over the last couple of years has been won by governments, where tech firms are now saying, "Oh, please regulate us. We're happy to be regulated. Please do whatever you need to do to regulate us, etc." So it seems to me that from the last 2 years, that the governments have been winning because they've been exercising their authority and the tools that are at their disposal. But we should also not think that the big tech firms will sit back and take it passively. They'll continue to find ways to shape policy, influence policy, shape governments in other ways. And one of the things that I've mentioned in a couple of other talks I've had is that ultimately, as citizens of a society, we need to be careful that there doesn't emerge an alliance between big tech firms and the nation state or governments. To me, actually, that's the more worrying part. As long as there's a tug of war between the two, I think the rights and liberties of the citizens will continue to win, or at least be fairly protected, right? But imagine a scenario where big tech firms and the governments become allies, because governments also need big tech firms, right? Whether it comes to cybersecurity, whether it comes to just tech capabilities, data, etc. Today, governments need big tech firms and their capabilities a lot. Big tech firms also need governments to make sure that they don't get broken up. So I worry actually a lot more that if there becomes a I scratch your back, you scratch mine type relationship between big tech firms and the state, I think that the rights of citizens and our values might actually suffer. So as I like to say, there's a triangle with big tech firms or corporations at one side, governments on the other side of that triangle, and citizens sitting on the third edge. Ultimately, a balance must be maintained between these three.
Mhm.
If any of these two become too strong, I think that we'll suffer. Right. So even if governments and citizens become too aggressive in shaping regulation and becoming very, I would say, let's say, protective about data flows, etc., then of course your innovation and tech economy will suffer. Similarly, as I mentioned, an alliance between tech firms and governments will not be good for citizens, and so on and so forth. So I think a balance has to ultimately be the goal between these three players.
Yeah, that's very well put out. And coming to the last part of the podcast itself, and I'm picking up where you left off regarding, how the rights of these citizens and, the liberties of citizens can be at stake with the developing technology. So in the final part of your book itself, you talk about different areas in which technology can make a substantial mark and kind of address global issues such as climate change or human rights. And at the same time, we do know that technology can be used as a stifling and impeding factor. Like you said, it can be used as a weapon to kind of stifle dissent, be used to prevent, citizens from accessing their rights and liberties. So, in your view, right, how does that technology kind of have the ability to tackle bigger issues such as these climate change and everything else? But also, does it also have the possibility that, the negative effects of the technological growth and technology itself can set us back a couple of centuries and, might kind of result in the degradation of the environment, can result in a regressive society. I mean, it can be anything. So, in your view, right, can technology, can the good of technology overcome the bad, or are we still at a point where we do not know what might happen?
Correct. That's right. I think the way you frame the question, I think, is a good one. That ultimately, clearly, technology does have the possibility of helping tackle some of the bigger issues that we are faced with. But clearly, it also does have the possibility of creating further negative effects and negative choices that could take us back in time in terms of progress, right? So clearly, it has the ability to do both. And therefore, I think the question is not whether it has the ability to do both or not. I think it clearly does have the ability to do both. I think the real question is, what are the choices, Arjun? What are the choices that we need to make today in terms of both the design of technology, the use of technology that we as societies and nations and as people need to make, so that we end up doing the former and not the latter. Former being that we end up using technology for good and not technology for bad, right? Very simply. So, and what are those choices? I believe that those choices ultimately come down to some of the debates we've been having in India and elsewhere around technology. Do we want technology to shape our values, or do we want our values to shape technology? Is it a one-way street? Will technology just shape us? Or do we, in fact, have the agency and the will to actually let our values also shape how we design technology, how we use technology, right? And to me, it's very important for us to, as a society, decide that and be clear that our values must also shape technology. It can't just be a one-way street where we are just these passive consumers of technology, that tomorrow if another social media app comes up that rewards us for spending more and more time on the phone and not with each other, that's what we, like, non-thinking, non-agency driven animals, just copy and continue doing, right? Or are we gonna, as I think Mr. Nilekani has also written in his book, are we gonna exercise mindfulness, or as he says, bitfulness? But are we going to exercise mindfulness and our agency to say, let's first, as a society, prioritize these values, XYZ values? And those values might differ by nation, might differ by society, might differ by region. But I think that, at least in the context of India, we should be clear on what are those values that we want to hold dear and adhere to as a society, and then make sure that technology is designed and used and built and adopted in ways that are in line with those values, right? So if we want a value to be sustainability, for example, then we must ensure that we are not ignoring the energy impacts of, let's say, Bitcoin, for example, right? Because these kind of myopic decisions were exactly what landed us in trouble in the first place. If you go back 200, 250 years ago in the industrial era, again, I wasn't alive that time, but I imagine that time the decision making calculus was thus. Oh, we are seeing such amazing kind of scale and efficiency in industry. Oh, so who cares if we are going to burn a lot of coal? We'll see. It's okay. For now, let's focus on scale and efficiency. The value that got emphasized that time was scale and efficiency and cheaper cost, not sustainability, right? And we are today suffering as a result of that value choice that was made that time by the industrializing nations of that time. So, come back to today, I think it's very important that we make sure that the values that are most important to us as a society must actually be for front and center. If sustainability is a key value that we as a society decide we need to adhere to, then technology must follow that value, right? Similarly, if inclusiveness or open competition or privacy, etc., are key values that we as a society come out and say this has to be paramount, then technology can very actually easily be designed to serve the same purpose, but keep those values in mind. There's nothing to say that tomorrow you couldn't build large tech businesses that have better privacy inbuilt into its design, right? So it's not such a clear trade-off between economic development and, let's say, that value of privacy. To me, it's just that that value discussion needs to be had first, and then the design of technology needs to follow, right? So I think it's those important choices that I've tried to highlight also towards the end of my book, in the concluding sort of sections, that these choices now that we are faced with are critical. Otherwise, we'll have this kind of scenario where technology actually takes us back as opposed to taking us forward.
Yep. That's a perfect way to put it and kind of end the conversation on. Thank you so much, Anirudh, for being here and doing this episode with us. It was really kind of nice to get well into the book and with someone who has actually written it from another perspective also. So looking forward to having more of these conversations with you and hope everyone gets to read the book. We will add a link to the book itself, the Amazon link to the book itself in the description. Please do check it out. And yeah, hope everyone had a good time listening to our conversation.
And a plug for bookstores also, Arjun. Buy it either on Amazon or in bookstores near you.
Yes.
But no, thank you so much for having me, Arjun. This is a fascinating conversation. Thanks for asking such, I think, significant and difficult sort of questions that framed, I think, a lot of the trade-offs that today we're dealing with. And so it's a pleasure to have this conversation. And thanks again to Takshashila for doing all the great work that you guys do. Right? I think you sit at that intersection of tech and policy that I think is so important today, as we've been discussing over the last several minutes. So thank you to all the work you guys are also doing at Takshashila.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anirudh. Yeah, looking forward to, I'm looking forward to at least having another book of yours come out soon. So let's see, and let's end this episode on that note. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. See you on the next episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
हम महिलाएं रोज के कामों में बहुत व्यस्त रहती हैं और हो भी क्यों ना, काम, पढ़ाई और जिम्मेदारियां सभी पूरी करनी जरूरी हैं। पर इन सब के बीच हम जीवन के एक बहुत ही जरूरी पहलू को नजरअंदाज कर देती हैं, फाइनेंस। इसीलिए हम आपके लिए लेकर आए हैं SBI लाइफ प्रस्तुत एक चुस्की फाइनेंस, महिलाओं द्वारा महिलाओं के लिए बनाया गया पॉडकास्ट। यहाँ मैं प्रियंका आचार्य, आपकी होस्ट, आपके साथ शेयर करूंगी कि किस तरह आप अपने फाइनेंसेस को बहुत आसानी से संभाल सकती हैं और फाइनेंशियली इंडिपेंडेंट बन सकती हैं। अपने 14 वर्षों का अनुभव लिए मैं आ रही हूँ हिंदी और अन्य 7 भाषाओं में हर मंगलवार नए एपिसोड्स के साथ IVM पॉडकास्ट नेटवर्क और अन्य चर्चित पॉडकास्ट प्लेटफॉर्म्स पर।